Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Barton, and I'm here with,
Reverend Abigail Conley.
and this is another episode of Bloody Mary Bible Brunch. The point of this episode is for Reverend Abby and I to have a chance to express our feelings and emotions about continuing to support the Black Lives Matter movement, and also some of the broader issues of racial injustice that we're seeing in the current crisis, including the way the pandemic is being borne not equally by all people. You just heard a reading of the Canticle of the Turning, and so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby to talk a little bit about that reading.
Yeah, so the Canticle of the Turning is a song version of the Magnificat written by somebody whose name I will add later because I do not remember, but that's okay. Rory someone. But it is a retelling of the Magnificat. So after Mary is visited by the angel Gabriel, she's going to have a child. She says, "Yes, behold, the servant of the Lord." She agrees to this. And then part of the kind of like, is this really going to happen? Is I'm going to go visit my cousin Elizabeth. And if I find everything, she's 6 months pregnant, she's visibly pregnant. If I find things like the angel said, then I know this is true. So she goes and she visits her cousin Elizabeth, and she finds Elizabeth 6 months pregnant, ready to welcome the prophet John and not that much longer. And so she says, she begins singing, and she sings this song that begins, "My soul magnifies the Lord." And from that Latin, we get the Magnificat, and that's where the name comes from. And so that song is simply a retelling of that. Nothing that isn't in scripture, just something that's easier to sing for us, that very much continues to name the work of God's justice in the world that will be made known through Jesus. I think it's especially powerful that at the very beginning of Jesus' life, we get this claim of what God will do. It does set the stage beautifully for the, like, God is going to do this sort of justice for people who are poorest.
And I think that idea of a new world that Jesus is going to bring about, and a new world of justice, speaks to our principles as Christians, and the way we see the change, or at least the way we should see change for justice, which is, frankly, there's that, the arc of history is long that bends towards justice. That's not the Christian vision. The Christian vision of what's to come is to totally wipe out the system of injustice, to destroy it, and to replace it with a system that's consistent with God's love and with God's kingdom. And I think in our world right now, those people who are calling for radical change, who are calling for a new world, and they're saying, "I reject the injustice of this current system," that call should feel very familiar to Christians, because that sounds like the call that Jesus was bringing in his ministry.
Yeah. And even in our prayers, Chalice still does a pretty traditional Lord's Prayer, and we could talk about my feelings about Trinitarian language that isn't masculine for a long time. But with that, we also use the phrase, "Your kingdom come." And even when preaching at most, I talk about "your reign," because we are talking about a system, a governmental system that looks different, something that mirrors those things, till our laws are more just and all these things. It looks very different than what we have now.
And I think it's important to recall, for me anyway, that Jesus disrupted comfortable systems, right? I mean, like, Jesus, throughout the gospel, what Jesus is doing is Jesus is making people uncomfortable. And Jesus is speaking a truth that people are not willing to hear. And I frankly think, as you and I, as two privileged white people who are straight, who are Anglo-American, who benefit in so many ways, are well-educated, we need to be disquieted. And that means, one, we need to speak against racism to other white people. White people need to talk to white people about racism. Racism is perpetrated by the majority against the marginalized community, and it's a problem of the majority, right? But then also we need to listen to things from our Black and brown brothers and sisters that make us uncomfortable, that make us feel like, I don't want to hear this. That's called prophecy, is that it makes you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. And when we talk about Jesus unsettling a system, we're talking about a person of color unsettling a system, and one that he is talking to other people of color about the system that isn't working, as people who were not in power, who were ruled by someone else. So it is this ongoing disruption of the systems that exist. I think especially, we're in a predominantly white church, not an entirely white church. And we are aware that one of the things that we are consistently being asked to do by Black leaders is not just talk about racism when there are Black people in the room, and not just talk about racism when a Black person is talking about it, or a brown person. We talk about it very much among ourselves and when there's no one else around. And we talk about ways that we can address racism when we see it. It is the very strange reality that the more power you have, the less able you are, or the less skilled you are in addressing kind of injustices, because you haven't had to do it for yourself. You haven't had to advocate. So even figuring out how do I challenge racist assumptions, racist things within my own community, becomes a point where we can at least educate each other and talk about things that we can do. One of my favorite.
I had this.
One of my favorite kind of ways of the confronting racism and sexism and those things is just the play dumb, I don't understand, and make someone explain the joke they just told or the thing they just said. And at least often that's a way of confronting their own racism. That's also a tool I had to learn, because guess what? If you have enough power, you aren't even familiar those tools are there.
I had an experience I've talked about before, I think, where I was in Indianapolis and I was stopped by a White Castle. I always get White Castles. I'm in Indianapolis, and it was late, which is the appropriate time to buy White Castles. And there were a group of young Black men that came into the White Castle. And I will admit that I experienced some anxiety about their presence. It wasn't super conscious. I didn't leave. I didn't do whatever. I didn't consciously do anything evil in response to their presence. But I will admit that I was a little bit anxious because those young Black men happened to walk into the White Castle at the time. And then a police officer from the Indianapolis Police Department walked in. And when the police officer walked in, I felt my anxiety level decrease. Okay? It occurs to me that those young Black men had the exact opposite experience I did. They went into a White Castle, which is a perfectly appropriate place to be late at night, as it should be, and they were fine. The middle-aged white dude probably did not distress them in that case. Middle-aged white dudes can certainly distress young Black people often, for sure, in other settings, but probably not at a White Castle. Mm-hmm. And then a cop came in, and then their anxiety level rose. And I think I share this story because I think it is such an example of subconscious privilege and how you have to take the steps to really think about how are we experiencing life differently.
Yeah.
If you were to call the sheriff's office because there was a problem at Chalice, you would believe that the sheriff's office would respond and would address that problem.
Right.
Now, as a minimum, you wouldn't call the sheriff's office if doing so risked a person of color's life. So that's the first thing, right, is that you're careful to not do that. But then as a minimum, of course, if we see vandalism and we're going to call the sheriff's office so they can respond to vandalism or note it down or do whatever, at the very minimum, we need to note that, this is an exercise of privilege.
Mm-hmm. And it is one of those things that, the only times I have called the police have actually been at my work. There have been 2 incidents of vandalism, and one of a white guy on our property that he had clearly jumped a fence. And that was its own thing. And he wanted a cool place to stay for the day. So I essentially did what he wanted me to do and called the police so they could go give him air conditioning and a meal that day, because that's what he wanted. So I'm like, okay, well. But even the act of calling the police, I think, is something, maybe because of my age, that I don't do readily or easily. And white people need to think about doing more often. The one time I've dialed 911, there was somebody screaming in a way that they were in harm. And I was staying with other pastors in an Airbnb. And so that's the one time. But it is the like, how do you think about this so that you're only acting when it's absolutely necessary, and you're not just behaving in a way that white people think they should, where it's like, oh, it's fine, call the police, they'll be here, realizing this might not be helpful at all, and it might end up costing someone's life.
And it's that serious. Like it's pointing a loaded gun at someone. If you're calling the police on a person of color, you're literally pointing a loaded gun at them. And so, I don't know, there might be times to do that, but that's the way to think about it, right?
Right. And I think for many of us, especially white women who consider ourselves liberal, Amy Cooper is the very terrifying image. I do not have to personally work to not end up with my knee on someone's neck. Like, I cannot imagine a situation in which that would happen. I am well aware if I call crying, somebody shows up and does something. And, there's even this written thing in our society that, like, a woman is crying, especially a white woman, we have to do anything we can to fix that. And so that for me is the much more terrifying kind of look in the mirror of, but you need to not be that person. This thing that is much lower level and seems much, much less harmful than what happened with George Floyd's murder.
Right. And just so, and your point being is that it you don't walk around every day saying, oh, I need to make sure I don't shoot someone who's unarmed, or I need to make sure I don't use unnecessary force when I'm arresting members of the congregation. That's not a problem that you have, right?
The same way that, like,
but your point is, it's
no, my point is that, like, but here's this thing that I could do if I call panicked, especially as a pastor, like, oh, wow, what do you need? Let's get that. And
it's wrapped up with all the historic issues of the ways that this wicked system that we are a part of oppresses people. And frankly, it gets into it also, I mean, that response of, here's a poor crying white woman, we have to take care of her. It also infantilizes the poor crying white woman. So it actually reinforces all the systems. The system of patriarchy that you need to have somebody with a gun come and take care of you and save you from this terrible black or brown person, and the deadly violence towards the black or brown person. It creates, this is all perpetuating a system of wickedness that I think it is totally fair for us to say. It's not the same system that Christ was dealing with when Christ was speaking truth to the Roman Empire, but I think it is still a system of empire and of hierarchy that Christ literally was so willing to protest against, that Christ was willing to be executed by the state to call out the wickedness of that system. And I think our system is as wicked.
And I would say even our system that is wrapped in Christianity is that much more wicked for being wrapped in Christianity. The Bible was used plenty of times to justify slavery, to justify racism, to justify all sorts of injustices against people. And we
also wanted to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We're sitting here, we're recording from Arizona. Arizona has a relatively, I would say, a very low Black population overall. We know where redlining happened. South Phoenix is the Black part of town for a reason. Glendale is incredibly diverse. We're in the shockingly white East Valley, and the farther east you get, the whiter it gets. We also know we're recording in state that has 33 Native American tribes on reservations. And the Navajo Nation is partially in Arizona, as well as 3 other states. And they have one of the highest per capita rates of COVID-19 right now. It's a community that has experienced systematic racism and dismantling of its culture and people. And part of the struggle, there's not access to healthcare. There's not access to running water in as many as like 30% of the homes. So we're not talking, when you say wash your hands, we have this community of brown people who were destroyed in many ways by colonialism, where washing their hands is not an easy task. And that is shocking and should be shocking and humiliating for us who are sitting here.
Right. And we have to live with the fact that we will not necessarily have something we can do about it now.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, part of what needs to happen in that situation is for us to just accept the wickedness of the system we have established. And it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
We can't get a pipeline of water. There's no, whatever maximum white savior complex you have in your subconscious, you can't, it's not enough to respond to these issues you're talking about like running water,
right,
about marginalized people living in poverty. Like, we can't fix that now. So there will be people who will suffer and die of a virus that they don't need to, because of a system that we benefited from. And at this point, like in the next few months, there's nothing we can do about it because of that, and that's the product of our sin.
Yeah. And often I've talked about, we have this kind of individualized version of Christianity in the US where it is my sin that I'm responsible for. And I am so much more worried about the sins that we all are responsible for and participate in. And, I was writing a sermon one day, and when I started to say something about Jesus' sin, I was like, oh, well, I just theologically crossed into a different place, and I should probably reevaluate a little bit. But it came out of the reality that Jesus is in a system that is also broken. And so how you interact with Samaritans, how you interact with a Syrophoenician woman is all informed by that culture. So when Jesus calls the woman a dog, essentially, and she responds, even the dogs get to lick the crumbs, that's its story rooted in kind of this racist system. And so even if
and on the flip side, well, I was going to say, on the flip side, when Jesus talks to the powerful person, the rich young man, the only way for him to receive salvation is to give up all of his power.
Mm-hmm.
He has to surrender all of his power. And so we, in the, when Pat does the worship and wondering, where are you in this story? In this story, we are the people in power.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that we can achieve salvation is by giving it up.
Mm-hmm.
We can't hang on to it. He doesn't say, but make sure you keep enough back to,
right,
to pay for your kids' college.
Right. But I think when we begin talking about all of those things, like even people who work to be actively anti-racist, white people who work to be anti-racist and to amplify Black voices and to talk to other white people and all of those things, we still have blood on our hands from all of the realities of racism. And I think that is where we very much run into the problem for white people of like, well, I'm guilty. It's like, yeah, you are. And we hope, our hope is that Jesus sets something else into motion, that there is a kingdom that looks different. But yeah, I'm guilty of racism. I am guilty of all sorts of people's deaths just by merit of participating in an unjust system. I can't get out of the unjust system either, which is also one of the devastating things, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think the last point maybe to make is that this, just because we don't have the answers doesn't mean we don't work for justice. Just because we don't see the end product, that doesn't mean we don't work for justice. And we aren't allowed to just give up. We aren't authorized to be nihilists. And so we have to still do those things. Speak about racism to other white people. When possible, give marginalized people's voice, lift it up and listen. And then we have to be hopeful because frankly, our situation is better than many who are oppressed, and they can't hope anymore because it's too much. So that's the other thing I think that we bring to the table is to be hopeful and to try and find a way to make things better.
And I would say that one of the things that our world is most in need of from the Christian narrative right now is repentance and forgiveness. Like this ability to say, I was wrong and I'm sorry and I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm going to change the way I do this. And to add, with the help of God, I'm going to change the way I do this, maybe with the help of my community. That
Right.
is huge. And that is something we do not know how to say as a culture.
Right. Well, I think that's some good advice for us to think about and for us to go forward. Anything else on this one before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, it's not a very cheery sign off, but it is our sign off. So we'll finish there. And until next time, cheers.